intro in the book of Ruth. It's a story about redemption. That's its theme. Redemption is buying something back or getting something back that's been lost. And speaking of redemption, what? You don't even know what I'm going to say. I have a redemptive football spirit right now after last week. If you're new to being a Bronco fan, this is what it's like. You got to get slapped around a few times before we triumph. And so that's what we're hoping for. I'm kind of moving on already. Just kind of. Some of you heard a dirty rumor that I witnessed that in person. Yes, that was true. And it was just as horrible in person as it was on your couch. Except I had to have Seahawk fans right behind me the whole time. But hey, I kept it together. And no criminal records came from the Super Bowl. The Carlucci family, that's a good thing. So, redemption. All right, I'm glad I get to teach on it this morning. We're in a series called Characters, and what we're doing is we're looking at certain characters in Scripture, both good and bad, and trying to learn certain lessons from them. So today, even more than teaching the story of Ruth, the book of Ruth, and really it's, we like to teach it together because it's one narrative, it's one story. Here's what's neat about Ruth. It's a picture of Jesus. All right, the whole book tells one story. It's laying out this foreshadow, this picture. It's an illustration of what Jesus would do for us someday. But there are some extraordinary people in the book of Ruth. And, in these 4 chapters, you see some incredible people. And there are several redeemers, a man named Boaz and a woman named Ruth. And this is what I'd like to do today in our series on characters. I want to zoom in on what makes Boaz special as a man. And I want to zoom in on what makes Ruth special as a woman. They are onto something. They understand what it means to bear the image and likeness of God. These were 2 people who at this point in their life knew the scriptures, and they would have known Genesis chapter 1. You can see it up here, verse 27. This is the first job God gave to any person that's ever lived, and that is to bear his image and likeness. He made us in his image, male and female, he created them. It's a great foundational verse that we have to build your life upon. Here's what I want you to notice. God is making a distinction between males and females. There is no order of importance, but he is making a distinction. There is a certain thing that a man is to do to be most alive, and there are certain things that a woman is to do that helps her to be most alive. In other words, they actually help us to put back into the world the very image of God. A man acting as a man in a masculine way, and a woman acting as a woman in a feminine way. Now, this is not a popular subject to talk about in America today, gender. We get in trouble. But this is what I want you to see. God chose your gender, and he gives us our purpose. And in our story about redemption, about God saving a family, we get a beautiful illustration, just one of many, one of millions, of what it looks like for a man to be masculine and a woman to be feminine. They find each other. God changes the world. It's an incredible story. And it would take both of them being the very person that God had created them to be. I'm going to use broad strokes to paint this, so please don't go down the road of me stereotyping certain genders. I am not going to do that. But I am going to bring some teaching about what these words mean, what it means to be male and female. And I'm going to use the example of Boaz and Ruth because they really help us understand. And these are characters worth learning from and following our lives after. All right, here's the story. There's a woman named Naomi, and she has a husband named Elimelech, or however you say that. It's some tongue twister. He was probably a Seahawk. Anyway. Just kidding. They live in Israel, and it's a time of peace. It's before Israel has a king, so it's kind of in that order. If you kind of know your Old Testament, your Hebrew Bible, it's the time of the Judges. And a famine has hit Israel, and so this family decides that they're going to move, and the husband and the wife with their 2 sons are going to move to a nearby nation called Moab, where there's not a famine so that they can survive it. Well, while they're in Moab, the husband dies. Elimelech dies, and Naomi is left with her 2 sons. Well, during this time, over the next few years, the 2 sons take on 2 Moabite wives. They marry 2 of these women from this different nation that they're at. One of them happens to be Ruth. The other one is a woman named Orpah. And they marry these 2 girls. Well, within a 10-year span of time, the dad dies and the 2 sons die. So Naomi loses 2 sons and her husband. The girls lose their husbands. They're now, you have three widows living together. And Naomi has this job to care for these daughter-in-laws. She feels responsible for them. It's a terrible situation. We're going to read in a moment, but she actually tells them to go back. Stay in your country, Moab. Hopefully you can go find a new young Moabite man to marry you. It's the only way you're going to have a future and a hope. And I'm on my way back to Israel. Well, the story is very, very special because Orpah, just looking at the circumstances, makes really what would look like a wise decision. And she stays in Moab, says goodbye. It's a sad scene. And she goes on and follows Naomi's instructions. But Ruth is relentless. And it's why she's special. She's extremely loyal, and relationships matter a whole lot to her. And Ruth decides to stay with Naomi, and the two go back to Israel, Naomi's home. Now, Ruth is the immigrant to try to build a life for themselves because, and we'll see in a moment, that Ruth knows that part of Naomi's fate is in her hands, and it's going to be very, very important. So they head back to Israel, and while they're there, they're trying to build a life for themselves. And Naomi and Ruth begin to take advantage of some really neat laws that are present in Israel at the time that help care for the poor. And they're not just traditions, but they're really God's instructions to Israel of how to live well in the world. And one of those instructions was the tradition of gleaning. And this is how it went. A farmer would have a field, and he would send his workers through the field, and they would harvest the field. But every time you would go through and harvest the field, certain things would be left behind. Well, the tradition of gleaning said you don't go back and get what you missed, but you allow the poor, those that are in need, to follow behind the harvesters, and that is theirs. That's their portion. So it's a way for them to care for themselves. It's a generous act. If you think about it, it has a lot more to do with how much we keep rather than how much we give. So it's very interesting when you think about possessions that way. But Ruth heads out to the field. She finds the courage. She heads out to the field, and she begins to glean in the fields. And that's where we see the really, she's already beginning to act as a redeemer, but this is where we meet the formal kinsman redeemer in our story, the man named Boaz. Boaz is very, very special. Boaz owns a field where Ruth is in. And Boaz is not just a man who is just making sure the bottom line, the job gets done. He's probably a very successful businessman, but he's not just concerned with those types of things, but he notices people. And he notices who's in his field. And so we're told that Boaz has the attention to look up and notice that there's this woman in his field that he doesn't recognize. It's Ruth. He notices that she's a Moabite. She's from a different nation. And he notices, because he cares, that she could be in danger. She's by herself. She doesn't really know anyone because she's not from here. And she could be taken advantage of. She could be hurt by other men. If she ends up in the field of an unjust man gleaning, he might take advantage of her or hurt her. Or get on her for taking advantage of a tradition that was for the Jews, and now she's a Moabite living there. And he notices her, and he cares for her. Now Boaz is a kind man. And so he goes to Ruth and he says, hey, I want you to stay in my fields with my workers because I want to make sure that you're safe. And not only that, but I'm going to be generous to you. And when you're thirsty, you can drink my drink. When you're hungry, you can eat my food. And you can glean in my field. Boaz is a kind man who notices, moves towards others, and cares for others. Now, here's what I want you to see from that Genesis verse. Genesis 1:27. God created them, male and female, he created them, okay? Male. It's the Hebrew word zakar. The Hebrew word zakar means this. Has kind of some layered meanings, as many Hebrew words do. They're so rich. They have, they mean several different things. But one of the things the Hebrew word zakar means is to notice the need of others and move towards them. That's exactly what Boaz is doing. From the beginning, when God made men, he put in us the purpose to notice others' needs and move towards them. To move towards others. Zakar also means to impact others as God would. To touch their lives. See, the distinctions that are made in Genesis 1 of male and female, they're not just physical distinctions, they're distinctions on how we are to relate to people, for both men and women. A man is to move towards others as he notices their need. He's to impact others as God would. And here's the other one that's kind of seems a little random, but it goes together. The word zakar also means to remember and act. But specifically, the word zakar, this is part of what it means to be a man, guys, to remember God and act. Okay, so we're told that God remembered Noah, zakared Noah, and acted. Boaz is remembering something here. He's remembering the generous God in whom he reflects. He's remembering the God who created him in his very image, and he's remembering his calling as a man to bear back to the world God's very image as a man. He's remembering God, and that is why he's remembering these traditions of being generous and caring for aliens and the poor and the widows. See, it's just one of many examples of a man remembering and acting. Guys must remember, and we have a very hard time remembering God and who he made us to be. Everything in our life tells us that our life is about us. The world will tell us that. Take care of yourself. Accomplish your things. Get your money. Get your things. Worry about your problems. Basically, life tells us that our life is about us, but it's not. To remember God as a male, as Boaz did, means to remember that our lives are not about us. Men, think of that. Your life is not about you. Women, get this. They're very caring and generous. They give their lives for others. Men must remember, because it's not in our nature in the very beginning. We have to remember, this is what God created us to do, is to remember that our lives are not about us. That is what Boaz is doing. He's noticing, moving towards others. He's impacting others' lives. He's remembering. Now, of course, these qualities aren't just exclusive for men. Women have these as well. But if you're a male, God has made you a male to be this way. That doesn't mean that it always looks the same. But this is what it means to be masculine. It doesn't always look the same, but God chose your gender. He chose my gender. And he has placed inside of our gender a purpose to move towards others, to impact others, and to remember the God in whom that made us, and we reflect his image. Now let me go a little further with this idea of masculinity. It's really important to understand this. Boaz is living out his masculinity in the world that God has given him, okay? And he's to do it relationally with the people around him. Men today are told that you prove yourself as a man, and these are just 3 ways to remember it, but they're kind of funny, but what's sad is that they're very true. We're told as men that you prove your manhood, and you live it out on the ball field, in the bedroom, and in the boardroom. Can you win? Are you good? How much sex are you having? Do you have the girls in your life that you want? And how successful are you? And how much money do you make? That's what we're told over and over again. This is what it means to be a man. Couldn't be further from the truth. To be masculine, as God is masculine, to bear his image means to notice those that are around us, to impact them, to move towards them, and to remember God as we do so. It's very different from what our culture tries to move us towards. Think of what people might be saying about Boaz at this time. This is what he's known for. Boy, did you see how Boaz noticed? Of all those workers out in the field, he noticed the one that was at risk. Or did you see how Boaz used his strength to care for her? Do you see how he's generous? See, what would happen with Boaz is not only would he care for Ruth in this moment in the fields, but later on Ruth would go back to Naomi, and Naomi would say, maybe he's our kinsman redeemer. Kinsman redeemer was a formal title that was another tradition in Jewish law that said if a family was forced to sell their land, and the land is what kept you from moving into generational poverty, it was the sign of wealth. If you had to sell that and lose it, the kinsman redeemer was a way to redeem what had been lost, and that included your closest male relative purchasing back, if he could, your land so that the family's future could continue. It's a beautiful law that someone would be generous. Well, Boaz says yes to this. It's this great scene in chapter 4. Boaz is standing at the city center, really, the center of the town, with some other men and women around, and he stands up and he advocates for Naomi and Ruth and says, I will be their redeemer. And not only that, but Boaz would take Ruth as his wife and say, Ruth, you don't have anything right now, but all that I have is now yours. Boaz noticed, moved towards others, impacted lives, and remembered God all along the way. He's an example of what it means to be masculine. Guys, one of the things we have to resist if we want to try to be this type of man is passivity. The world will make us passive. It will work really hard to say, let someone else handle it. Sit back and don't say anything. Don't move towards your teenage daughter who's hurting right now. Don't move towards your wife. Don't move towards the situation at work. Our tendency is to be passive. This is what else the world will do to us. The world will make us feel like we're not important and we have nothing to offer. It will make us feel weak. God is always calling, bear my image. As a male, with Zakar, move towards others, impact others, and remember. That's what we need to do. Here's a great quote by C.S. Lewis. He says, when a man turns to Jesus and seems to be getting on pretty well, in the sense that some of his bad habits are now corrected, he often feels that it would now be natural if things went along fairly smoothly. When troubles come along, illness, money troubles, and new types of temptations, he's disappointed. These things he feels might have been necessary to rouse him, to make him repent in his bad old days. But why now? Here's the answer. Because God is forcing him on or up to a higher level, putting him into situations where he will have to be very much more brave, more patient, more loving, more than he ever dreamed of being before. It seems to us all unnecessary, but that is because we have not yet had the slightest notion of the tremendous thing that God wants to make of us. To bear his image as a man is a special gift. To move towards others, to care for others. Now here, let's move on to Ruth. Ruth is really the main character of the story. In fact, the book is named after her. So many people have wondered, why is the book named after Ruth when Boaz is the formal kinsman redeemer? I think this is why. Ruth faced more adversity. She overcame more. And in a sense, she's to be more admired even by men. Ruth is amazing. She faced this great trial. And she, from moving to Israel to going to the fields, going to Boaz, hoping that he would take them on as his kinsman redeemer, it would take great courage. But Ruth in this story is acting consistent to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, with this idea of what it means to be female, and it's the Hebrew word nekabah. And nekabah means this. So women, remember, these aren't just your qualities. Guys, we can have some of these as well, but God chose your gender, and this is what it means to be a woman. And these are broad strokes, but they're full of meaning. To be a woman, not just physically, but relationally, means to receive others. It means to welcome them into relationships. It means to invite others in, not just to receive, but to invite others in. And it means to nourish relationships, to give back. So, of course, this is true physically, but it's also true relationally. This is what it means to be feminine. By the way, these are all virtues of God. They are just as important as what I just earlier described with men. Just as important. They are qualities of God. Unfortunately, they're not celebrated enough. Just like men, this doesn't mean that this is all every woman is. It doesn't mean that this plays out in the same way for every woman. But God chose your gender, and he gave you your purpose as a woman to bear his image in this way. So think of Ruth. Look how she's receiving others in relationships. And she's nourishing relationships. And look at how loyal she is. She's been hurt. She's lost a husband. But yet she's going to stay loyal to two important relationships. The first one is to God. She didn't know God when she lived in Moab until this family moved there and she married this Hebrew boy. And then at that point she heard about the God of the Bible and had an experience with God and said, I'm leaving all these other gods behind because that's the one true God. I want to follow him. She's been touched by God. And part of the reason she moves to Israel is because she's being loyal to her relationship with God. She's a woman of faith. And because of that, she's willing to risk safety and her future and comfort because she says, I've got to be with him. I've got to be with that God. But she's not just loyal to God, she's also loyal to Naomi. This is incredible. Chapter 4, verse 15, after this whole thing is played out and Boaz takes her as his wife and they have a child, I love what Ruth says to Naomi. She says, they have a child. And she says, that basically, this is a gift for you. And she says, because your daughter-in-law loves you. See, to be feminine, there are tones, of course, of this idea of relationship. It's no wonder that women are more empathetic most times and better listeners. Not in every case. This is because this is who God has made you. Ruth is living out her feminine qualities of God by staying loyal to the relationships. You know what she's doing? She's saying relationships matter more than wealth, safety, and even a future. That's amazing. Relationships, people matter more than those things. What an amazing image reflected back to us of what God is like. God says the same thing. Relationships matter more. And Ruth is living it out right here. Not just for Naomi, but for us, because we've been given this story. Here's what else I see in Naomi. She's so dedicated to relationships that she's willing to make incredible sacrifices. I hope you've had the pleasure of having a mom who loved you this way. It's not always the case, and we're sorry when that happens. But most moms do this naturally. They sacrifice day after day, small choice after small choice for their families. It's amazing. Why? Because relationships matter. Ruth is willing to make incredible sacrifices for Naomi. But here's what I want you to notice about Ruth. There's this other quality in here, and often it just gets attributed to men. But she's the one showing courage. Ruth is the brave one in the story. She's the one that finds the courage. She was afraid. She was wondering, what's going to happen with my life? My husband's gone. His family's gone. She could have tried to control the situation and just gone with what was in front of her, what seemed logical, instead of trusting God. But she didn't. She found the courage and the faith. And a lot of times, courage and faith are the exact same thing. But she had courage. And so she went to the fields. And then she went back to Boaz, hoping that he would take her as his kinsman, as he would redeem them, and that he would even maybe take her as his wife. She found courage over and over and over again in a terrifying situation. And she's been hurt. Her heart's been broken. Yet, she continues to find courage. She's incredible. It's a combination of beauty and strength, brokenness and courage, loss, but a willingness to receive others and new relationships. Think of what others might have been saying about her back in Moab. Can you believe that she's going to value this relationship with her mother-in-law more than her own future? We don't know anyone like that. Can you imagine when she was in Israel, those women looking upon Naomi and Ruth saying, look how brave that girl is. Can you imagine what the men were saying? She's a woman of incredible loyalty and sacrifice. That was her reputation. That's who she was. Now, I do want to say this about what it means to be feminine and masculine. It's usually women that object, because you usually have to hear from guys like me about messages like this. And one of the questions, the objections that comes, people ask, does it always look the same? And really behind that is you have certain stereotypes. To be feminine as God created you, do you have to fit certain cultural stereotypes? And the answer is no. To be masculine for men as God created, does it mean that we fit every cultural stereotype? No, don't even go there right now. Just hear what God is saying about the way that he created us. Doesn't always look the same, but this is the very character that he's put inside of us. And we are most alive when we live this out. It also doesn't mean that these qualities are exclusive just to men or just to women. There is overlap. But these are the things that God has put in us to make sure they insert themselves into the world, because this is how the world gets changed. The feminine and masculine qualities of God being lived out among his people. That's how the world gets changed. By the way, the situation could be reversed. Ruth could be the one with the land and the power. Boaz could have nothing, yet they would still both be called to be the person that God created them to be. Ruth be a feminine woman made in the image of God. Boaz be a masculine man made in the image of God. Situation could be reversed, yet they're still called to be that person. Why? Because God chooses our gender, and he gives us our purpose, and there's a purpose that comes with that. They're most alive when they act this way. Now, thank goodness they had this figured out. Because not only did it change the life of Naomi and her descendants, her family, but it changed our lives as well. And I want to make a connection here because there's a third redeemer in the story. Boaz, Ruth, but there's a third redeemer. I mentioned in the beginning, it's Jesus. The whole story is about him. N.T. Wright has this great quote. He says, when it's all said and done, the Bible tells just one story. The story of Jesus redeeming the world. The two of them would marry and they'd have a son, and his name would be Obed. You could read this in chapter 4, verse 17. Obed would be the father of Jesse. Jesse would be the father of David. Gene taught on David last week. David is Israel's greatest king. He's the archetype, but also the direct descendant of the perfect redeemer and the perfect king that would come someday, born in the same town that David is from, Jesus, Yeshua. You see, in so saving this one family, they kept the line of Jesus alive. They lived out the very qualities of Jesus. And Jesus does the very same things that Ruth and Boaz did in every one of our lives, and even in a much greater way all the time, to change the world, to redeem people, to redeem situations, to pull it out of the pit and to make it good, to take dead things and make it alive. He does it all the time. Thank God that Ruth was who she was and Boaz was who he was. Thank God. And by the way, I want you to notice, most of these virtues are being lived out in the story before they're ever married. They're single and a single widow, and they're living it out. They're not waiting to be this person when they have that special someone. No, not at all. They're living it out in the situation that God has them in. All right, worship team, you guys could come up, and I want to end by making a couple applications, and I really just want you to look at the redeemers in this story. I just want to go over them again. The three redeemers, Boaz, Ruth, and Jesus. Men, we need to look at Boaz, because as I said earlier, our culture will work really, really hard at celebrating our passiveness, and it will make us feel like we are failures, because we do fail, but it'll make us feel like we have nothing to offer. There's no weight to our lives. Those are lies. We need to look at Boaz, who is an example of Genesis 1:27. God made men masculine, zakar. And so we need to resist passivity. We need to notice people around us that are in need and move towards them to care for them. We need to seek to impact the world as God would do it. And most importantly, we need to remember the God of whom we come from and live like him. Message over message. This is what it means to be a man. How about we just remember who God made us to be? That would be a great start. So we need to look at the Redeemer. Women, you need to look at male redeemers as well so we can celebrate them. The second redeemer in the story is Ruth. And so women, I really want to encourage you, as well as men, you can look at this and admire them. But women, this is who you want to be like. Ruth. She was not helpless. She was not powerless. She did not seek to just control the situation because fear had set in. No, she was a woman of deep faith and loyalty. She was full of courage and willing to sacrifice. And look what she did. She continued to receive people, even when she had been hurt. She continued to give and to nurture others, even when she didn't have a lot. And she invited others in. And she changed the world, not just a family. To receive, to nourish, to care for others. Man, these are great women when you have them in your life. Here's the other thing I want you to see when you look at these redeemers. God found it good to put us together. Men need women, women need men. At the very least, so that we can have an accurate picture of what God is like. Because God has a masculine nature and a feminine one. And we have the job of showing him off to one another as we live as he created us. What a great, great calling. And so I want you to think of this. For the men in the room, I want you to think of the women in your life. And I want you to celebrate them some more. Let them know. Let your wife know. Let your daughters know. Let your mom know. Let your friends know. Your coworkers know. Your sister know. The beauty that you see in them when they act like God as a woman. Celebrate it. Call it out and enjoy it. And women, likewise. When you have a man in your life, a husband, a dad, a brother, a son, a coworker, a friend, a grandpa, and when they live out their masculine qualities of God, and you see them noticing others and moving towards others and impacting lives and remembering God, celebrate them. They're giving you a gift because they're showing you what God is like. So look to the Redeemers. And last one is this. It's to look to Jesus. We can't be reminded enough of how special he is. This story and their lives are about him. Think of this. Just as Boaz did, Jesus looked up and noticed people in need. All of us. All of us in spiritual need, relational needs, physical needs. He noticed. And he didn't just notice and remember God, but he cared, so he acted, and he moved towards us. He's like Boaz. But he's also like Ruth, who stayed open to relationships. It says relationships matter more. I'm open to you, and because of that, I'm willing to stay loyal to you. I'll never leave you or forsake you. I'll make incredible sacrifices for you. He's just like Ruth. See, Jesus is the perfect portrait of God's redemption. But together, we get to paint the same picture. That's why it's really important that we're together. Regardless of your place in life, we need one another, and we're to be a gift to one another. All right, let's pray.